Thrilled to have Dr. Gholdy Mohammed joining me this week. Gholdy began her career as a middle school reading, ELA, and social studies teacher, but she's currently an associate professor of literacy, language, and culture at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She studies Black historical excellence within educational communities with the goal of reframing curriculum and instruction today. Her scholarship has appeared in leading academic journals and books. She's also received numerous national awards and is the author of the best-selling book Cultivating Genius, an equity model for culturally and historically responsive literacy, which is going to be the focus of our conversation today. She has not just had an illustrious career so far, but she has had an impactful one, and there are absolutely no signs of her slowing down. So, Gholdy, I want to welcome you to the Tom Schimmer podcast.
Thank you, Tom. Such a pleasure to be here.
Great to have you on. I've been trying, listeners, full disclosure, I've been trying to get Gholdy on the podcast for about a year, and she's incredibly busy, but has been gracious enough to join me today. So I'm really excited about it. I know she's on a tight schedule. So we're going to dive right into our topic today, which is the book Cultivating Genius. So not to hold you accountable for every word you wrote, but on page 9, Gholdy, referring to the context, I love it when people do that, right? Page 9, you said this. It's like, I don't remember what I did yesterday. Never mind what I wrote on page 9 4 years ago. Yeah, right. But anyway, having said all of that, on page 9, you are referring to the context of the 1800s and how Black people in the United States faced multiple attacks of oppression. And you wrote that, quote, literacy was no longer just a set of skills to possess, but the instruments used to define their lives and the tools to advocate for their rights, end quote. So in essence, you say that literacy is much more powerful than just acquiring the skill to read, but that literacy in terms of reading and writing are actually transformative acts. So help us understand that. How so? How are literacy and reading and writing, how is literacy more than just the skill set, and how is it transformative?
Yeah, so I first started to, if I can go back to going into the research of African American or Black literary societies in the 19th century. I came across this rich legacy, this rich American history, this rich Black history. These literary societies were organized to come together to read, write, think, study mathematics, science, art, language, all these things. But they had abolitionist spirits. They were abolitionists. And so as they were sort of, cultivating their learning, their education, which included reading and writing practices, I saw that they were doing something more than just skills. I mean, they were learning the skills, things like speaking and writing and communication and reading and things like that. But then they would take it, and their literacies had greater purpose. They needed it for their lives. Literacy was connected literally to their lives, in ways of using language to define who they are, using writing to write out their truths and write out the things that were most urgent of their pens. They use their literacies to teach themselves and others, to cultivate their genius, and also remind them of who they are and whose they are, their power. So literacy became like this source of empowerment. In addition to skills, it became a source of knowing who I am. In addition to skills, it became a source of changing the world around me in addition to skills. So it's like connected to all these greater pursuits in life.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have to admit to being naive and ignorant to this notion of the literary societies that developed. And can you tell us a little bit more about just how they were organized? How did people hear about them? How did they know? Like, how did that all sort of come about?
Well, and I have to say, Tom, in many ways, so many of us didn't know about this part of history because there was an agenda to erase it.
Right.
When I go back into other parts of archival history, I find things like the measuring rod of textbook selection, which was a guidebook for what types of curriculum is selected and rejected in US public schools. And part of that commentary of that text, it said, do not put things like the genius history of Black literary societies. Do not teach children that. Teach only about Black people being happy as slaves. That was the language of that text. So I want to first start with saying there was an intentional effort to erase Black genius. And you can
Mhm.
argue that that still exists in many ways or across different spaces today. But when I look at these spaces, they were organized by African American people who had some freedoms and liberties in the northeast part of our country, right? Cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia. And one thing I know about Black people then and now is that when there is need for joy, a need for social change and advocacy and activism, we're going to do one thing: we're going to organize, we're going to come together. And so maybe it's just in us. Maybe it comes from the African diaspora, but that's what we did. We organized around literature and reading and text. And we knew that education was important and prominent. We knew that since, for generations. And they organized around the one thing that they held of value: education. And they came together. It was sometimes memberships, and they made it like formal, right? They didn't just come together like in a book club, but they had a preamble and a constitution, and they sort of outlined what we would call today like bylaws of membership. They had membership fees, and their membership fees, after they paid bills, it went to cultivating their books in their libraries. And they met in places like basements of buildings, churches, auditoriums, homes, anywhere they can get a space. There were membership numbers of 10 to over 100. And the ways in which these organizations spread, and like things will spread when it's good.
Mhm.
And so it was through their literacy practices by speaking, public addresses. They would say things like, we need a literary society in every town because it would be the nucleus of our people. That was some of the language that was expressed, eloquently in public addresses. It was spread with the inception of Black newspapers and Black print. Before 1827, Black people didn't fully exist in the entirety of our lives in other newspapers. They just didn't post about our joy and our happenings. It was always like these deficit postings in other newspapers. So in 1827, a year before, the first documented Black Literary Society, we started the Freedom's Journal. And so these literary societies spread there, pamphlets, writing, speaking, all sorts of ways to engage with one another, and other communal spaces like anti-slavery societies and benevolent societies. There were all sorts of societies at this time. And, they just spread the word. When something is good and great for a people and for a society, words spread. And then leaders would take up the charge and start a literary society in their space and in their space, both Black men and women. And it sort of just spread. It became across different states and cities.
It is a fascinating history to me, and certainly I appreciate your mentioning that there wasn't a purposeful effort to erase that from history, because again, so many of us did not know that history. But it makes perfect sense when you sort of pull back the lens and think about how societies have evolved
Mhm.
around the literacy skills. You go back to the Middle Ages and the evolution of the written word and access for everyday people in becoming literate, and therefore becoming empowered in changing society. So it makes perfect sense, and just not knowing that. Now in the book, Gholdy, you use the term, this is a term I've not heard before, and I was really drawn to it, the term historically responsive as opposed to just culturally responsive. Which is one, again, that I've not really heard that much before. So I think at this point most listeners would understand culturally responsive, at least to a certain point. We've heard that term, it's familiar, we kind of have an understanding. But what do you mean by historically responsive literacy?
Yeah, so historically responsive is like more of my take on the literature, the scholarship
Okay.
of culturally relevant, culturally responsive. And we see this, right? We see
Mhm.
scholars in their research finding, unique sort of intersections to the work, or we see this with like culturally sustaining, cultural modeling, funds of knowledge, third
Mhm.
space. It's a lot of cultural models out there
Yeah.
that sort of fall within the lines of culturally relevant or culturally responsive pedagogy. But in my work, as a historical researcher, I go back, I like to go back to the past in order to understand how to reshift things around or shift things around and rewrite, guide us in the present and in the future. And so going back into these literary societies, and they left like meticulous artifacts for us. It wasn't
Wow.
like it was just, I mean, we know there weren't just one literary society, but there also wasn't just one artifact. It was like
Right.
I would be beautifully drowning in the literature, like in what the ancestors left for us. And I
Mhm.
felt like they were guiding me. I would read something and that would take me to another place and another place and another place. And as I was reading what they left for us, their poetry, their announcements, their speeches, their activities during literary societies, it was making me into a better teacher. And
Mhm.
I said to myself, well, this sounds like I felt like a model coming along. Like it felt like I would read a lot on this area, which spoke to identity, and this area that spoke to social justice, and
Mhm.
this area that spoke to more traditional academics. So, the process as a researcher, that's what I was discerning. I was sort of organizing, what I was reading and coming to understand. And I created a model. We created a model. I say the word we a lot because I think everything I do is with the ancestors,
Right. Right.
and with so many other scholars who have put out such beautiful work. And so we created this model um, of different pursuits for education, different pursuits for learning. And I added to the culturally responsive literature and made it historically responsive because if we follow these pursuits, the same five goals of education that the ancestors follow, in many ways we're being responsive to history.
Ah.
We're going back in history as a way of innovating what we are doing today. It's weird to think
Right.
about history as innovation,
Yeah.
but in many ways, it is. If you think about innovation as like forward thinking, forward moving us forward, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's culturally responsive because it honors the previous scholarship and the thinking around the work of identity and cultural competence and academic success and social political consciousness and things like that. But it extends it by creating like a 5-part framework in
Yeah.
which teachers, practitioners, leaders, whomever can pick up and use. So that's the historical part because it stems from the genius of history.
Right. I wonder, as you were talking about the formality of the record keeping and how abundant the records were, and the formality of the process. They had constitutions, they had memberships, they had all of that. Was there any indication as to why they were so formal? Here's what I'm thinking, Goldie, and I'm wondering about your perspective or if there's any historical record of this. I'm wondering if the formality around the literary societies had more to do with the idea of we're taking this seriously. This is not just a hobby. This is a very important. So in the moment, we need to be formal about this, or I suppose, was it that we need to make this formal so that there is a record, so that as others try to actively erase the record, that there is an abundance of a record that says that this is what we were cultivating. A little bit of both. Was there any indication for you? Do you know what I'm trying to get at with this?
Absolutely, I do.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think about that question a lot, and I've come to these sort of understandings in my mind. Um, and I think some of these understandings are backed by evidence of history. First, I think that we have to understand, Black folks, when they were stolen, Africans,
Yeah.
from their land, the first thing they stripped was their culture, their identity, their names, their language, big parts of our culture. And so part of it is like this was the American culture. This is how you organize. This is how white
Mhm.
folks were organizing.
Right.
And for many people who had freedoms during that time, they were assimilating to that culture,
Mhm.
and we see it even in like language and dress. But, you know, in their minds, they may have been thinking, like, what else am I? This is all I may know.
Mhm.
So I think part of it is like that's the culture of the time. And before they created their own spaces, they had there were white abolitionists who were, inviting them into their spaces, and they were using that as a model. So they may have kind of used it as a model.
Right.
I
Interesting.
also think that this idea of record, like putting my voice on record, when you read the opening lines of the 1827 first Black newspaper, the Freedom's Journal, it says, "We wish to plead our own cause. For too long have others spoken for us." And, part of establishing newspapers or organizations was to say, I am here, I have a voice. I don't want to just exist physically, but I want to leave my experience, my name, my advocacy in print. And print is permanent, like writing is so permanent. So I think
Mhm.
it was kind of a blend of all those things.
A little bit of both, yeah, or all of it, and certainly, you talked about history being innovative, but that is the stuff of legacy, right? That is what legacy is. It's the carrying forward of the historical impact and the monumental moments and experiences that we bring forward. That
Yeah.
really is the stuff that the development of your framework on the shoulders of the literary societies is exactly the stuff that legacy is made of. So I love that. In your equity framework for literacy, you conceptualize four layers or goals: identity development, skill development, intellectual development, and criticality. So I want to save that fourth one for a moment, the criticality. But can you walk us through the specifics of those kind of first three in terms of your framework now that you talk about? So identity development, I think you've kind of talked about that, but just give us a synopsis of each of those, and then we'll get to criticality in a moment.
Yeah, identity is just defining self. Who are you? Who are you not? Who do you desire to be? My work of identity goes beyond just racial or cultural or gender identity,
Mhm.
or any other cultural identities, but it can be your personal identity, your personality, and
Right.
your identity as a traveler, a writer, someone who likes to, take things apart and put them back together. I want classrooms to be spaces to nurture and cultivate and sustain who students are. The skills pertain to those proficiencies and those what we call like state standards, what we
Right.
want children to be able to do and learn across specific content areas. Intellectualism is sort of like the skills put in action in the context of the world somehow.
Okay.
We spend a lot of time with like skill development, but how am I supposed to use those skills? So, what people, places, things, concepts, histories, current events am I connecting the skills to?
Mhm.
So, you can see how skills and intellect, they're very cognitive, but they play a role together. It sort of like takes the skills and put it in the context in the real world.
Mhm. Mhm. And just going back to identity, what I was thinking of as you were talking about identity is that in terms of my voice and expressing myself in terms of who I am, or does my identity also cultivate in terms of what I consume?
All of it. All
All
of
of it.
that is
Yeah. Okay.
identity. And
Right.
it's also like how other people perceive you.
Hmm.
Your context, all of that helps to make sense of who you are.
Right.
So,
Right.
it's a wide, all these pursuits are so vast and
Hmm.
on their own. But, to sort of bring it down a little bit, I help teachers to understand, how am I doing some identity work with every unit playing? You're not going to get to
Right.
all the identities and all the
Hmm.
manifestations of identities for
Hmm.
each child. But the goal, right, is to connect and make, classroom spaces where I affirm or learn something about myself or other people.
Right.
Mhm.
So who am I? Develop my skill and now take that and put it into practice in the real world to take it and put it into action. So criticality,
Mhm.
if that is the desirable goal, then how do we, and by we I mean teachers, how do teachers continue to help develop that in our learners? What is criticality?
Well, before we develop anything within our learners, we have to develop it within ourselves. And that
Okay.
includes identity and skills too.
Okay.
Believe it or not, I work with ELA teachers who hate writing. And I said, you have to cultivate your skills for writing and your love for writing before you teach it, right? And the same goes with identity. If I feel uncomfortable with myself, how am
Mhm.
I really going to help a child know themselves?
Yeah.
But criticality it stems from critical theories.
Okay.
And so it's more than just critical thinking. A lot of people hear criticality, they think critical thinking. But in my
Mhm.
work, I call it big C critical
Okay.
thinking, critical thinking about power, justice, equity. So criticality is defined as the ability to name, understand, question, disrupt oppression or hurt, pain, and harm in the world.
Mhm.
To work to disrupt it in a way working toward a better humanity. So criticality is the social justice piece, it's the equity piece,
Mhm.
it's the piece that looks at things like inclusion, diversity, representation, and humanizing things, right?
Mhm.
Whether it is like a criticality topic can be like environmental justice.
Mhm.
It can be, helping children to disrupt negative self-talk. Like, I can't do this. I'm not a math person. That's
Right.
criticality because it's like you're disrupting your own power inside of you that is harming you in a way
Right.
when you tell
Right.
yourself those things. It's like a form of self-harm. But
Mhm.
it also can be like racism, sexism, anti-homophobia, religious discrimination, ageism, anything that inflicts a form of harm. And so the goal for criticality is to connect it to the learning in the classroom and have students like name these problems and problem solve for the betterment of humanity overall.
Right. You mentioned the criticality comes out of critical theory, and I think just for listeners who may not be familiar with the framework of critical theory, of course, I'm sure most people have heard of critical race theory, but for critical theory, if you could give just a quick sort of definition or context around what is critical theory.
Well, theory, first people got to understand what is theory. Theory helps to explain phenomenon. It's not
Right.
strategies, it's not going to solve. We don't typically teach theories. We have instructional methods and pedagogies that are informed by multiple theories.
Hmm.
And what makes it critical is that it's some kind of examination of power, systemic, structural power, oppression, inequities, justice. So when you get into those terms, those critical terms, let's just call them, that's what makes it critical theory. And so
Hmm.
if you are trying to, let's just say, Tom, say, okay, students are not achieving. Why are students not achieving? A theory will help to explain that. Something like cognitive theory may say, well, they're not decoding language. But social cultural theory would say, well, there's too much distractions around the classroom. That's why they're not achieving. Critical theory will say, how was the curriculum constructed? Was it constructed to reflect the literacies and liberations and identities of that child? It's going to look at the power structures, right?
Hmm.
And so my model really takes up multiple theories. And critical race theory like focuses on all of the power structures, but particularly when it comes to race and racism.
Right.
So, folks are struggling or they're just kind of like taking one thing of what they hear and they're not being scholars of their lives. I don't care if you're a teacher, you will have a responsibility to seek truth and knowledge and not
Yeah.
just listen to anything you hear if it's
Right.
not the truth.
Yeah, for sure, and certainly, it is my understanding. Correct me if I'm wrong. Critical race theory was originally a legal framework to examine the legalities of structures within the government and in our greater society. And of course, every soundbite and snippet on the news has spun critical race theory into a sort of a different thing and a different thing altogether in some places, and certainly gets misrepresented. Am I correct on that? That it was a legal framework?
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. You're right.
yeah.
And then, it was brought into education and
Right.
the field of education. But that idea of sound bites,
Hmm.
that is not an intellectual space. And
Absolutely.
metaphorically, I feel like curriculum has felt like sound bites instead of
Yeah.
being like the full and expansive landscape of knowledge.
Yeah.
That's what we're
Certainly.
moving away from.
Yeah, the and social media doesn't help this. Listeners, you've certainly heard me rant about social media several times about just how we've reduced things to these snippets and these pithy little quotes and comments that really don't reflect a thoughtfulness. So, Goldie, I really appreciate that. I'm picking up what you're putting down. We need to be more intellectual and scholarly about what we consume, how we consume it, how we process it,
Yeah.
and all of that. Let's finish up by talking about historically responsive texts and what is, I think, a very salient point in the book, and that is that most children's books do not represent people of color or their experiences. And even the books that feature diverse characters, even sometimes as the protagonists, are not often written by authors of color. So is it a cultural understanding in that I, as a middle-aged white man, I could write a book featuring diverse characters, but the nuances of the culture may not be fully represented or captured or articulated in that book, or is it the idea of representation in that young readers of color need to see that their stories can and should be told through the lens of the authors of color? Is it all of that? Is it more? Am I like, why is this so important? And how do schools go about, again, purposefully reconciling this, I suppose, challenge that we face and making sure that we have historically responsive texts in our schools?
Well, the reconciliation is not really with the schools first, it's with publishing companies,
Fair enough.
who they choose to publish and who's not.
Mhm.
I get the question all the time from teachers saying that, is it okay or should I be selecting a book that's about a person of color in their culture, but is written by a white person? And so I just simply say, would you buy a cookbook that I wrote if I don't cook? Now I can research everything from a cookbook. I mean, it'd be like the best cookbook. I mean, you never know that I don't cook every day.
Mhm.
And then you would say to me, you typically the teachers say to me, well, it might be a better author to buy a cookbook from, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it's almost like that. It may be pretty good. I mean, there are some books that are just bad and like they should have never written that. And then
Yeah.
there's some books that like, they honor the legacy, the genius, the joy of the culture, and they've done some work. But the problem is we don't bring in enough, we don't publish and bring in enough, authors of color who are steeped in the culture, who can bring in those nuances you mentioned.
Mhm.
And a lot of those authors, like they self-publish. So sometimes it's like maybe we got to dig a little bit more or go beyond like traditional spaces. We will find text. But in another way, for schools, it should just be there for them. Teachers shouldn't have to dig so much. And that's why I said it's like a problem and an issue also with like publishing houses,
Mhm.
which, everything is reflective of society. So when
Yeah.
we see certain things in society, we see certain things in publishing houses. Then we see certain things in our schools, right? But what I'm pushing for, let's just call it like higher levels of culturally responsiveness. To me, representation of a character or a theme or a topic that is very cultural or diverse, that's just like a basic level of CRE. I don't
Mhm.
recommend that at all. I want representation plus pedagogy and assessment, right?
Right.
People think, oh, just because I have a character of color in a book, and it can be a really great book, but you still teach skills only, you still assess skills only. That's not CRE to me. That's just representation.
Right.
And so
Right.
I'm trying to push where we have spaces in classrooms where students see themselves, they're affirmed, they are loved, their culture is reflected, their cultural practices. Plus, we have these pursuits, right? And I recently added the pursuit of joy, where we're teaching about beauty to balance that criticality, and we're assessing those pursuits. See,
Right.
that's when we have, to me, and I've seen it the last 12 years, that's where we have like excellence in U.S. education. Right now, we have, what do we call them? Sound bites.
Right. Yeah, it is going beyond that sort of just representation, and which can really feel a little token in some respects. Certainly, those nuances and that cultural representation, and it really, I think, a lot of it, Goldie, comes down, for me at least. I think of the word authenticity. It comes down to an
Absolutely.
authentic way that we lift culture and create a more expansive view in society about. The different cultures that are represented in our community, and giving them equal voice and equal representation, for sure. Fascinating conversation, listeners. You can see why I wanted to have Goldie on the podcast for many months. But we've got two questions left as we finish up today, and these are questions I ask everyone who comes on the podcast. And the first one, you can take this in any direction that you want to. It can be about what we've just talked about. It could be something else. But the question is simple. Educationally speaking, what keeps you up at night?
Two. I would say like two things.
Okay.
One is like the problems, like when you see like excellence in the 1800s, and like we are still doing things not like connected to that, and reading in the news, and the tragedies, the spirits being broken, the dignity being broken of our children, the mediocrity, all of that keeps me up, because I find myself thinking of like plans. I mean, I have plans outlined for the United States. That's my mind. Like I have to create solutions or responses. And then the second thing that keeps me up is like the joy and genius of teachers I get to work with. I mean, when we come together, it's really curriculum. Like to me, curriculum is more than just lessons and units. It's like the story, it's the art that we bring to our children. And when I get into my artistic mode of curriculum development, it's like I'm just up, and I'm what when a painter will be painting, I'm painting curriculum. And so I can't stop. And I've gotten better over the years, like, like a bedtime and an alarm clock. But those are the two things for sure.
Yeah. Well, that keeps you up in a good way, for sure. It is interesting. You mentioned the problems, and we think about, sometimes I look at society and I think, boy, we have come a long way. And then at the same breath, I think to myself, or maybe myself, I think to myself, we're still doing that. Like that is still 200 years ago, and we're still wrestling with this issue. It
Yeah.
seems like we've come a long way, and yet we have simultaneously still a long way to go. Last question as we finish up, Goldie, is about success, personal success, professional success. Again, take this in any direction you want to. But if a random person stopped you on the street and just said to you, "What's your definition of success?" how would you answer them?
I would say that, if you help to make this world a better place, small or large, you are
Mhm.
successful. If you made the people who have elevated you, lifted you, birthed you proud, it could be the ancestors, your parents, your grandma, your teachers,
Yeah.
that's success. Like, really, it's just about, I know we connect a lot of different things like awards and careers and money to success. But the more I get to live on this earth, I realize that the more I am able to help someone and give and use any talents or gifts that I have to not just give to other people, but to accept and to like become smarter and to learn from humanity, that's the best form of success, because I feel like everything else will come when you do that.
Right.
The jobs, the awards, the success, the
Mhm.
money, whatever like people traditionally define, all that will come if you're making this earth a better place to live.
Yeah, making the world a better place, and certainly representing those that supported you along the way. Again, we've talked throughout our conversation about legacy, and that is the legacy. What
Yes.
we bring to the world is a representation of everyone who has supported us along our journeys. Listeners, you can and you should definitely follow Goldie on both Twitter and Instagram. The handle is at Goldie M. That is at GHOLDYM. I'll have links in the show notes for both of those social media accounts. And of course, the website is www.hillpedagogies.com. Gholdy, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. I really, really do appreciate it.
Thank you, Tom. It was a joy.